Our moral to this class was not just take the book's word for what it says. We shouldn't just believe everything the book has to say. Instead, students should search for why the book says that. What observations, experimentations, evidence gave them that answer? When I one day teach math, I want to include this philosophy into my teaching style. Math is such an old practice, much like science, but it's rarely changed. We still use formulas created hundreds of years ago, which is fine, except because it rarely changes, there's this feeling, this idea created that makes students feel as if they only have to memorize the formulas and trust that the formulas work. That's not what math is. In high school, I rarely remember doing proofs for any of the formulas I've used so many times. I believe it's very important for students to at least understand that mathematicians didn't just throw letters, numbers, and symbols together to make answers. There's so much reasoning behind the formulas we blindly use. I'd also like to incorporate the social aspect of this class into my classroom. I think peer evaluation and conversation can be extremely important in advancing your knowledge. In math, many students might find different answers, and it's important to allow each other to explain how and why they came up with that answer. Teachers aren't the only ones who should be teaching. Students need to teach each other as well. Not to mention, if students discuss with their peers, then all the students will be more likely to be engaged and focus in the work. Much like science, sometimes math has alternative methods to reaching the same answer. Peer review and conversation can spread knowledge and alternative methods to other students. Perhaps a student might like another method, but they're just not aware of the method at the time. One thing I had continual trouble with throughout the entire semester was how to explain science in non-scientific terms. One of the major goals of the class was to be able to explain science in everyday language, in language a young student would understand. The only way to get better at this would be to practice it. At first, I wouldn't put much effort into it. To be honest, I didn't put really any effort into it because I just didn't have things to explain. Later, as lab went on, Jacqueline did an amazing job of helping me practice this ability. Even in labs that are very self-explanatory, she would ask me to explain to her exactly what happened without leaving any details out. Every time I used a scientific word as acceleration, momentum, or pressure, she would ask me to clarify what the word means. Lab after lab, I began to get better and better at explaining what I observed. There was one lab in particular I recall that really changed my thinking. When explaining this happening to Mrs. Vance, I couldn't help but use the word pressure. She asked me how to say it without pressure, and I couldn't do it to save my life. And this was actually the lab right here that I was talking about. It was the lab where we had a flask, and you put your hands around the flask, and then as you put your hands around the flask, the liquid inside would start to move up the tube, as you can see right here. And basically when I was explaining it, I kept using the word pressure. I kept saying, oh, well, the heat from your hands warms up the molecules, and there's high pressure inside. And she kept saying, well what's pressure mean? And I couldn't explain it without using pressure until after a while I just started to think of more of the definition of what pressure actually is. And eventually I came to the conclusion where I explained it as the heat warmed up the molecules and they started to bounce around, started bouncing off each other, started bouncing off the walls, and there was no place for them to go other than up and out this tube. And so that's why the molecules started to inch up and start going through the tube. And after that, I got much better at explaining things simply because I rather looked for the definition of the terms instead of using synonyms for the terms, which just made it much more clear to explain.